You are now listening to the E-Watchman Podcast with your host, Robert King.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for listening to another episode of Jehovah's Watchmen. This program was recorded on September 11th, 2024, it being the 23rd anniversary of the terrorist attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. I remember where I was that day. It's like when big things happen, you remember where you were. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the ramifications of what happened that day. As you may or may not know, I have used EIR as a source of information, EIR standing for Executive Intelligence Review. And I found it to be the most reliable source of in-depth investigation into things. Lyndon LaRouche, of course, being the editor. And at the time, Lyndon LaRouche was running for president in the year 2000. And when George W. Bush won the election in December, a month before the new administration came into office, LaRouche said that we could expect a Reichstag-like event. Of course, he was referring to the fire that burned down part of the parliament in Germany, the Reichstag. And that event, which many feel was sabotaged by Hitler, that event catapulted Adolf Hitler into his dictatorship. And of course, we know what resulted from that. But the Bush administration had within it these so-called neocons, Paul Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, the vice president. And they had become disciples, so to speak, of Leo Strauss, who was a college professor in Chicago, and he developed this idea. It was really Nietzschean Nazism dressed up as, American exceptionalism. And the neocons adopted this sort of Nazism combined with British imperialism as espoused by H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell, who were proponents of world government. Well, let's go back a decade to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And a lot of people felt that there should have been peace then. The Cold War had ended, but it didn't really. That's when the United States embarked on this goal of world domination. And it began building military bases ringing all around Russia and China. And it kept pushing NATO's borders closer and closer to Russia, absorbing some of the Warsaw Pact nations that had been allied with the Soviet Union when it existed. And they thought they nearly had Russia on its knees because of Boris Yeltsin basically giving the keys to the kingdom to London, City of London bankers and Wall Street fellows, and they privatized a great deal of Russia's assets until a fellow by the name of Vladimir Putin came along and started clawing back national assets. And of course, he's been an enemy of the Anglo-American Empire ever since. But with 9/11, that was the Reichstag fire that LaRouche had warned about. It was just a month later that war was launched against Afghanistan. That was supposedly where bin Laden was holed up. And bin Laden was this, poster boy of evil. A lot of people don't realize that he was actually trained by MI6 as a terrorist, as Al-Qaeda. He was part of a Mujahideen, which, I don't know, maybe some of you have seen the YouTube video of Zbigniew Brzezinski in Afghanistan. He was a national security advisor, I think, to the Carter administration. And back during the Cold War, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. And so the Anglo Empire was training these terrorists to fight the Russians. So they've always had control over these terrorist groups. And as a matter of fact, one of a certain General Flynn blew the whistle when Obama was president that the United States was training and arming terrorists to overthrow the legitimate government of Syria. They called them moderate radicals, moderate terrorists, whatever. Yeah, that's funny. But LaRouche used to call bin Laden Osama bin London because he was an asset of the British. He had a house in London. Anyway, going back to the start of the Bush administration in January, they had their first cabinet meeting, and the Treasury Secretary, Paul O'Neill, wrote later in his memoirs that he was astonished because the topic of this first cabinet meeting was, how do we go to war against Iraq? What's the best way to justify taking out Saddam Hussein? Regime change, right? And he was totally perplexed and puzzled. Why is this an issue? Well, he found out. And they got rid of him eventually, but there's a few honest sorts of fellows around. Wesley Clark, another military man, revealed that when this Bush administration came into office, they were handed a program of nations that were going to be overthrown in the Middle East. And on the list of targeted nations was, of course, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, and Iran. And did I mention Syria? Yeah. So they're about halfway through that list, I'd say. But we'd have to say that Iran is the big dog. It is rumored now that they do have a few nuclear weapons, and they certainly have hundreds and thousands of missiles that can reach all through the Middle East, could absolutely devastate Israel. So they've held back on that. It's interesting that after Israel took out the leader of Hamas in Tehran, everybody was expecting Iran to retaliate, and they said they were going to retaliate. They had already fired some rockets into Israel a few months before in retaliation for another assassination. But interestingly, they have not retaliated. And I think that's because Vladimir Putin has persuaded them to hold on. And in fact, Putin supplied them with anti-aircraft missiles and other long-range rocketry, and not just for self-defense. And now we're hearing reports that Iran has sent some of their missiles to Putin. So it seems to me that they are going to coordinate a revenge, an all-at-once, all-out attack to take down the Anglo-American Empire. But when the Bush administration began implementing these regime changes across the Middle East, and of course, in 2014, they took down the government of Ukraine and installed their puppet and allowed the Nazis a free hand in the government, and they began persecuting the ethnic Russians in the east of Ukraine. Killed about 14,000 of them so far, and that provoked Putin. They say it was an unprovoked invasion, but that was nonsense. So now they've got their big war. And now just this week, there's been a lot of debate. Zelensky supposedly, keeps clamoring for longer range missiles and for permission to strike deeper and deeper into Russia, which he's already doing, but only with small drones that cause minimal damage. He wants bigger ATACMS missiles and cruise missiles to start hitting St. Petersburg and Moscow. And although the United States has said, no, we don't want to escalate, now we're hearing reports that they're going to give Ukraine permission, which means that it's really no longer a proxy war. That because NATO not only has to supply the weaponry, but also the intelligence, the logistical support, the GPS, and all of that. So we're really coming to the point where NATO has declared or undeclared war against Russia. And that's World War III, obviously. But what I think people don't realize, we see this Anglo-American bully who boasts of being the exceptional nation. I don't think most people appreciate that it's being set up to be destroyed. And not by Russia, and not by China, and not by Iran. But the dark powers that be are manipulating this conflict, knowing that the United States is going to go down. And the United States is the big dog. It's controlled the world since the end of World War II. The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. You all know that. 9/11 set all that in motion, the perpetual war. The United States has been at war since 1 month after 9/11, when, as I mentioned, when they invaded Afghanistan. And again, that's what LaRouche warned again. That was the goal of the British Empire, which has really taken control of the United States through agencies that are supposed to protect national security. I'm talking about the NSA and the FBI and the CIA and the Homeland Security and on and on and on. I don't think, people in these agencies can be that incompetent. It is a deliberate top-down policy intention to drive the United States into destruction. And the same thing is happening, of course, in Britain, in France, in Germany, in the EU in general. I mean, Volkswagen is the quintessential industry of Germany. It's been in production since the days of Hitler. Hitler was proud of the Volkswagen, the people's car, right? And now it's talking about shutting down factories. Why? Because they can't compete. And why is that? Because the Anglo-American Empire blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, which delivered cheap gas to Germany. And now they have to pay much more for gas, and factories use a lot of gas in the manufacturing process. And so we see this deliberate destruction of an economic powerhouse. And talk about a Reichstag fire. We can compare that to 9/11, but there's been another one, the so-called January 6th insurrection. And this was, talk about an agency that is against national interest. It's now all come out that the FBI had, undercover agents that took the lead into luring these patriots into the Congress Hall. And ever since then, it's been cast as an insurrection. So now patriots have become the new terrorists. Citizens are no longer citizens of their country. They're being replaced by millions and millions of immigrants. And it's not just that, that Homeland Security is turning a blind eye. No, they're facilitating it. They're flying immigrants in, giving them debit cards and cell phones and on, giving them housing. While millions of people, citizens of the United States, and same thing in Britain, they're going homeless. So this is a deliberate overturning of an established system, the democratic nation-state system. Well, what does any of this have to do with the Bible, with Bible prophecy? Well, I believe it has a great deal to do with it. I believe that we're witnessing the beginning of the fulfillment of an extraordinary prophecy. And I'm speaking in reference to the prophecy in the 7th chapter of Daniel. That is where Daniel, who was living in Babylon at the time, had a dream. And he saw visions in his head as he lay upon his bed. And he wrote down the dream, and he recorded the complete account of the matters. And we can read about it. He saw these 3 huge beasts coming up out of the sea. One was like a lion, and another was like a bear, and another was like a leopard with 4 heads. And then he saw another beast, a 4th beast, and it was terrifying and fearsome and unusually strong. And he described it as having large iron teeth. It was devouring and crushing, and what was left it trampled down with its feet. He goes on to say, this is the latter part of verse 7, it was different from all the other beasts that were prior to it, and it had 10 horns. While I considered the horns, look, another horn, a small one, came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were plucked up from before it. And look, there were eyes, like human eyes in this horn, and there was a mouth speaking arrogantly. Well, Daniel went on to see a vision of heaven, and he saw a vision of Jehovah God himself. A throne was set up, and the Ancient of Days sat down on the throne. And his clothing was white like snow, and the hair of his head was like clean wool. His throne was flames of fire. Its wheels were a burning fire. And a stream of fire was flowing and going out from before him. 1,000 thousands kept ministering to him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. That's 100 million, by the way. The court took its seat, and books were opened. He goes on to see that someone like a son of man gains access to the Ancient of Days, and he's brought up before God, and rulership and honor and a kingdom is given to this Son of Man. Well, Daniel's head was just swimming seeing this vision. And he goes on to say that he was frightened, but he was curious as well. And so he went up to one of the angels that were in his dream, and he wanted to know especially about this 4th beast. Well, the angel said to him, as for the 4th beast, there is a 4th kingdom that will come to be on the earth, and it will be different from all the other kingdoms, and it will devour all the earth, and it will trample it down and crush it. And as for the 10 horns, 10 kings will rise up out of that kingdom, and still another one will rise up after them, and he will be different from the first ones, and he will humiliate 3 kings. and he will speak words against the Most High, and he will continually harass the holy ones of the Supreme One. And he says he will intend to change times and law, and they will be given into his hand for a time, and half a time. But the end of the matter is his rulership is taken away, and he will be destroyed completely. And the kingdom will be given to the holy ones. That fourth beast, of course, was the Roman Empire. Historians will tell us that the Roman Empire fell, and it surely did. One reason was because of the perpetual warfare that it fought. Sounds familiar, huh? But the kingdom didn't really die. It changed. And because Constantine had made Christianity the state religion, and the clergy, the Pope, gradually amassed great power. In fact, it became the empire. The Holy Roman Empire, it eventually was called. But eventually, the British Empire ascended. And, well, the Watchtower claims that that is the little horn. And the three horns that were plucked out, well, that happened back in 1588. The first horn was plucked out anyway, was the Spanish being one of the 10. That makes sense, right? The Spanish Armada was defeated in a battle with the English, although in reality, most of the Spanish warships were sunk by a gale and not necessarily by cannonballs. And of course, the British fought many other naval battles against the Dutch and the French, and they did prevail. And by the mid-1850s, the Victorian British Empire reigned supreme. But that doesn't really make sense that the Netherlands, France, and Spain were the three horns that were plucked out, because those three nations are still very much in existence and very powerful. France especially. When we look at the permanent members of the so-called UN Security Council, it's Great Britain, France, and the United States. And the other two members are, of course, China and Russia. Don't ask me why the most populous nation in the world, India, doesn't have a permanent seat, but I'll leave that for someone else to argue. Anyway, the point is, the British could not have plucked out the Dutch and the French and the Spanish. Those three nations are part of the EU, right? And so was Britain at one time. But I believe we're seeing the ascendancy of that little horn right now. An empire which is intent on destroying the United States and Great Britain and France and Germany as well, as I mentioned, the powerhouses of the EU. And keep in mind, this little horn grows and grows and grows till it reaches the point where it plucks out the other three, and uproots them. So there is a period of time as the horn gains more and more power until the time that his rivals are uprooted. And I believe we're in that point now. It seems to be accelerating, this war against the nation states. It's no secret that the United States is on a course of bankruptcy. They add $1 trillion every 100 days to their national debt. And now the biggest expenditure of the national treasury is paying interest on the debt, the $35 trillion debt it's already accumulated. So everyone knows that can't go on, but they just keep printing money. But at some point, obviously, it will crash. No one knows the day or the hour, but I suspect it will come about when the missiles start flying. And that will be the end, when NATO and Russia and China and Iran and North Korea get after it. And I'm telling you, the United States and its allies will not prevail. And that will coincide with what we read in the 13th chapter of Revelation about the head of the wild beast that received what looked like a mortal wound. But it comes back to life. But it comes back in a different form. We can be sure that when the United States goes down, how long it takes to come back, it won't be a democracy. It won't be a republic. It'll be a dictatorship with a very large arsenal of nuclear weapons. Yeah? And again, that 13th chapter of Revelation says that he saw a two-horned lamb come out of the earth, but it began speaking as a dragon. Well, isn't that what it says about this little horn, that it has a mouth speaking arrogantly? And if you click on the little footnote there, it takes you to Revelation 13. It says it was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and it was given authority to act for 42 months. That's the same as the times, and half a time, 3.5 times, 3.5 years, 1,260 days, 42 months. So the Watchtower has interpreted all of these things to the past, and I've been saying for the last couple of decades, it just ain't so. You know, there's a saying among Jehovah's Witnesses that prophecy cannot be understood until it is fulfilled. Well, apparently that's the case. I don't think these things have been fulfilled, but the Watchtower does. But it will take this earth-jolting disaster, tribulation really, for them to understand, right? Only terror will make them understand. It's interesting about this little horn that comes up. It not only has a mouth, it really hasn't begun blaspheming God yet, but we can see it's going there, right? But this horn also has eyes all over it. Well, what does that mean? Well, we see with our eyes, and this ascending empire has many eyes. It doesn't tell us how many, but we get the impression it's a lot of eyes. So that must mean it can see everything. Not that it's the Almighty, but when we consider the power that has been amassed by what is called the deep state, the empire, it is capable of monitoring every communication through the internet, on private phone lines, you name it. There are dozens and hundreds of satellites looking down upon us. Edward Snowden tried to warn us about that, didn't he? And of course, he had to flee for his life. He's been given sanctuary in Russia. It is interesting that this deep state, this empire that wants this global government, has symbolized itself by the occultic eye of Horus. And that eye, of course, has been on the US dollar. Actually, it's a Federal Reserve note. And on the back of this so-called Federal Reserve note is this eye within a pyramid capstone. And the capstone is hovering over the pyramid. It's suggesting that at some point the capstone will complete the pyramid. And that will be their new world order. And it says it right there on the dollar, doesn't it? Novus Ordo Seclorum, New World Order. And that New World Order is an empire with Satan enthroned. And the reason it will be Satan enthroned is because Jesus will have left the building, so to speak. God has been using nations up to this point. I spoke about this recently. Paul said that the superior authorities were placed in their relative positions by God, and they are our ministers. How do they minister to us? By keeping law and order. But what happens when Jesus is given his kingdom, as it pictures there in the 7th chapter of Daniel? Then obviously Jesus will no longer be supporting these earthly kingdoms. They will have served their purpose. And so they're essentially handed over to Satan, the devil, to do with as he pleases. And he's given permission to harass the holy ones of the kingdom for 42 months. And he demands that we worship his political system, his wild beast, in the image of his beast. And he'll speak blasphemous things against Jehovah and against the angels of heaven. So we're not there yet, but I think we're getting pretty close. I do remember what I was doing on 9/11 in 2001. I was in Houston, and my wife was in another city. We had both been there visiting my mother-in-law, who was in the hospital, and my wife had to go on a job interview in Detroit, of all places. And I was scheduled to fly out of Houston that morning. And I had my suitcase on the bed packing up, and I had CNN on and saw the first plane crash into the tower. And oh man, that plane must have gone off course. And then the second plane hit. And of course, everyone knew that that was an act of war, an act of terrorism. I remember I called up my dad, and we were talking on the phone. He was watching it too. It's like, we're at war, man. And the United States, as I say, has been at war ever since. And it's intended to be a perpetual war that will never be won, but only lost. All the airlines were shut down immediately, except they spirited bin Laden's family out of the United States. Yeah, can you imagine that? Here's this fellow that supposedly masterminded this terrorist attack, and they let his family fly out of the country, and no one else could get on a plane. Fortunately, I had a rental car, and I drove up to Indianapolis to see my father, and I met Catherine. That was really an eerie, strange time, because I was one of the few cars on the freeway. It was like